Okay, great. Good afternoon, comrades. Welcome to this edition, which is presented by Comrade Jeremy. Today's presentation is Social Reproduction, a Marxist approach by Comrade Jeremy Cronin. As you all know, he's a member of the SACP Politburo. So without any waste of time, I will be inviting Comrade Jeremy. You can see him, and he will be able also to greet you. And then once he starts presentation, we will be able also to see the slide that he has presented. Good evening, Comrade Jeremy.
Good evening to you, Comrade Tom, and also to all of the comrades who are listening in. I hope you are all staying safe, looking after yourselves, and we've got quite a lot of ground to cover. So let's dive quite quickly into the topic.
Thank you very much.
So if Comrade Tom could present put up the slideshow that I will speak to, that would be useful.
Just a few seconds. Okay, there you go.
There we go. Okay, so social reproduction, a Marxist approach. Let's go to the next slide. Right. Now, the party, the SACP, has been saying in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis that we've got, that we cannot go back to the crisis before the crisis. Now, but what was the crisis before the current COVID-19 crisis? Well, for neoliberals, for mainstream economists, for the commercial media, the crisis before the crisis, they said, was the public debt, was the fact that we were going to fall off a fiscal cliff. It was the fact that the ratings agencies had given us junk status. And for them, therefore, the cure was more austerity, more cutting back of the public sector wages, more liberalizing the labor market and the financial markets. But as far as the SACP was concerned, we already had austerity, and their solution to the problems was more austerity. And I mean, just to have a sense of the kind of austerity that we've got, you will have noticed, comrades might have noticed, that 50 days into our lockdown, our Minister of Health, Comrade Zweli Mkhize, was still calling for public sector nursing posts to be unfrozen in provinces. I mean, so it just shows you what impact neoliberal macroeconomic policies have had. Let's move on to the next slide. But for the SACP, the crisis wasn't junk status, but it was the crisis of unemployment, of poverty, of inequality. And as we know, all of those things are strongly marked in South Africa by class, by race, by gender, age, and also by where people live. The crisis linked to all of those things was also a crisis and remains a crisis of high levels of violent crime, especially gender-based violence. Crisis of municipalities. Many of our municipalities, including in Mpumalanga, are battling for basic sustainability. We know that many of our public schools are dysfunctional. Our public healthcare system is, really battling, and public transport for the majority of the working class is also very problematic. There are crisis levels of household debt in South Africa, and there's also food insecurity. And the COVID-19 crisis has just deepened and made more obvious all of these dimensions of the South African crisis. Let's go to the next slide. So let's then move to, because I believe that addressing the question of what we call social reproduction from a Marxist perspective helps us to understand better the challenges we've got, the particular kind of challenges we've got in South Africa, and also what is the way forward. Now, just to revise very quickly, of course, at the heart of Marx's critique of capitalism was to look at not what happens at the level of social reproduction, but what happens in production itself. And of course, Marx's famous work, Das Kapital, in particular, focused on this. And so what he did was he critiqued liberal economists who look only at the market, basically, who treat the economy as if it was just a market of buyers and sellers. And what Marx did was he went into what he called the hidden abode of production itself. What is going on in factories, down mines? What is actually happening there? And his analysis was to say that workers sell their labor market, their labor power, to the capitalists for a wage. And of course, liberals will portray this as a fair market exchange. The worker sells his labor power for a day, and he or she gets a wage in return. So that's a fair market exchange. But what Marx's analysis said was that the value of what the worker produces in a single day is greater than the value of his or her daily wage. And this is the exploitative process, and this is the source of capitalist profits and of the exponentially growing capitalist class power over the working class in society in general. So it's not just one individual worker providing hours of free work, basically, to the capitalist, but something like 10 billion workers around the world who are working in production in one form or another, producing this surplus. And that obviously creates huge wealth for those who are appropriating that wealth. But that wealth also leads to power as well. It means that the capitalist class can buy up the media, it can buy votes in elections, it can basically dominate society as a result of this expropriation. Let's move along. So that's the fundamental law of how capitalism functions, okay? But then we need to ask another question: who produces the producers? And this is where we enter into the domain of social reproduction. And for a brief definition of what we might mean by social reproduction, I've used a very well-known academic Marxist from the United States who's been writing a lot recently about this, and I've given a reference for those who want to follow it up. But she says that social reproduction can be understood as the work of birthing and socializing the young, caring for the old, maintaining households, building communities, sustaining shared meanings, what she calls affective dispositions. I mean, basically producing culture and culturing human beings and the horizons of value that underpin social cooperation. So that's a slightly academic definition, but I think you get the general drift. But in any case, it's what our societies have long understood in essence. I mean, there's the wonderful Sotho proverb which says, moto ke moto kabato babang. A person is a person because of other people. Margaret Thatcher said, society, there's no such thing as society. They're just individuals entering into the marketplace. But earlier societies, non-capitalist societies, and socialists all understood and understand that, you know, people only become people in the context of socialization and social reproduction. And no society that undermines social reproduction can actually survive for long. I put in brackets the point that, of course, also no society, no economy that destroys also the natural, the ecological conditions for its reproduction and its sustainability can also last for long. And that's a topic of another huge discussion, as we know that capitalism is destroying the possibility for human civilization on Earth. But let's leave that for another debate and another discussion. Let's move to the next slide. Now, so any society needs to have not just production of things that people need, food and so forth, but also it needs social reproduction. And I want to look in a general sort of way how social reproduction tends to function under capitalism, more specifically. So under capitalism, the wage of the worker is meant to cover the cost of feeding, clothing, and housing him or herself, but supporting a family, in other words, new generations, the next generations of workers. And capitalist production, like any economy, requires social reproduction. Without social reproduction, there is no working class to work in their factories and down their mines and in their banks. But of course, individual capitalists and individual capitalist firms don't like to carry the burden, this responsibility. They like not to have as little as possible responsibility for it. So how workers get to work, what kind of housing they live in, and so on. Those are costs that capitalists and capitalist firms don't want to carry, either directly or indirectly by paying higher taxes so that the public sector can supply decent housing, decent transport, and so on, decent healthcare and education. And it's this reluctance of capitalism to take seriously social reproduction that capitalist societies are always haunted by crises of social reproduction, along with other crises, economic and financial crises, and these break out continuously. Let's move along. Next slide. Okay. So what COVID-19 worldwide has exposed is the huge interdependence of production and social reproduction. And it's also highlighted in South Africa the pre-existing crisis of social reproduction. So we know that to flatten the curve, as comrades in government have been saying, we had to have home-based lockdown was needed. But household self-isolation, which is possible for me, someone like myself, is completely impossible in crowded townships and informal settlements, many of them without running water, some of them, if they're lucky, they've got communal toilets and so forth. So, you know, that era of that area of social reproduction, the township, the informal settlement, was in crisis before COVID-19, and COVID and our attempts to flatten the curve through the lockdown and so on inevitably ran into the crisis and heightened the crisis. The same with the return to schools. I mean, the working class can't go back to school fully unless their children are able to go to school or able to go to creches and so on. But we know that because of poor spending in the public sector, crises in public sector schools and so forth, it's very difficult for effective measures to be implemented in terms of social distance, proper sanitation in schools. Over 60% of the working class depend on overcrowded minibuses for public transport. And to lessen, in the midst of this pandemic crisis, the dangers of infection, the minibus sector has been required to halve the number of passengers, down to 7, basically. But the minibus sector, which operates outside of the formal capitalist system, and it's part of the social reproduction of the working class, can't sustain itself at current fares when it's got half the load. I mean, comrades know that taxis don't operate on schedules, basically. They wait until they've filled up and then they move. So these are just some examples of how the crisis in South Africa of social reproduction has been made more transparent, more obvious by COVID-19, but also reflects the fact that even before COVID-19, there was this crisis of social reproduction. Next slide. Okay, so this is a photo of Sasolburg, I think. And I'm just making the point that what goes on in front here in this township, working class township, care for children, creches, all of those things are absolutely essential if what's in the background, that modern industrial plant, is able to function, if workers are able to work, and if there's a continuous supply of workers. So there, under capitalism and all societies for that matter, social reproduction is absolutely essential for production itself. Let's move on. Okay, now, just to have a very brief history of social reproduction. Let's note, for instance, in pre-colonial African societies, especially here in Southern Africa, the work of production, farming, cattle herding, making of pots, weaving of baskets, doing the things, producing the things that society needed, and the work of social reproduction, caring for young and old, educating people, sharing meals, maintaining households, and so on. All of those were largely centered around the homestead and the extended family. So there wasn't a big separation between the homestead, the house, and the workplace. There was, of course, and as comrades will know, because many of your grandparents and great-parents, and perhaps still some of your parents will be living in a situation that still has some of these features. There was a gendered division of labor and an age division. So young boys were expected to herd cattle, men had tasks and women had tasks. But there weren't sharp class divisions, especially in African societies pre-colonialism here in Southern Africa. Okay, and in fact, this was not just here in Southern Africa, but all early civilizations had this general pattern. Let's move along. Next slide. Okay, now, with the arrival of industrial capitalism, which began in Britain basically in the early 19th century, what we see first and foremost is that the capitalists need to create a working class. A working class doesn't, a proletariat, a capitalist proletariat doesn't exist without the massive expropriation of peasants, basically. expropriating them from independent means of production, from their land, through the forced expropriation of common land and so forth. So in the early 19th century, a major process of proletarianization happened in Britain, for instance. And this created a massive floating population, which had no way of surviving other than by offering itself up to the capitalist system for wages. And so there was this, what we could call a huge reserve army of labor. Capitalism also then increasingly separated productive work, which happened in a factory or in a mine, from social reproductive work, which tended to be in the home or in the broader community. And men and women in this early phase, young children even, were compelled to work for survival in mines and factories for long hours. I mean, they were working in the early 19th century. 5-year-old and 6-year-old children were working for 16 hours, 18 hours, and so forth in terrible conditions. Very little thought at first was given by the early capitalists to social reproduction. So the working class was living in squalid conditions, and there were terrible outbreaks of epidemics. And this resulted in a massive crisis of social reproduction. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, these are screenshots, so the quality of the pictures isn't so great. But on the left is a woman in England pulling a cart with coal in an underground shaft. The young woman. In the center are young boys. They look as though they're about 11 or 10, who are factory workers. And then there's the famous work by Frederick Engels, who was the first really to study the conditions of the working class and the crisis of social reproduction in early capitalism. In the famous work that he wrote, The Conditions of the Working Class in England in 1844. And that's available online for free if any comrades want to read it. And what's very striking about reading it as a South African in 2020 is what he's describing is very familiar in many respects and could apply to informal settlements in South Africa, working class townships, and so on. Let's continue. Next slide. Okay, I don't know how clear this is, but this is a picture basically called A Court for King Cholera. And basically, this is probably at the same time that Engels was writing. So it's a working class area, community, which looks a little bit like a street in Alexandra with some differences. But on the left is a dump of litter, basically. Kids are playing in it. A woman is scratching in it for some crumbs of food. The houses are massively overcrowded. And already by the 1850s and so forth, philanthropists, more enlightened capitalists were deeply concerned that these living conditions, the conditions under which the working class was expected to reproduce itself, was also causing huge pandemics, which of course then also spread to more wealthy areas. Let's move along. So that was the first crisis of social reproduction under capitalism, was this reality. And this crisis provoked increasing working class struggles, but also more enlightened capitalists and philanthropists and others to drive reforms. There was factory legislation. There was an improvement sometimes in working conditions. Length of the working day was restricted down to 10 hours. Child labor was increasingly outlawed. Women's work was also, was legislated against, and so on. And there were also slum clearances, which to some extent might have improved the living conditions of the working class, but it was also a way of moving working class settlements away from more middle class and capitalist settlements. A bit like group areas removals and a bit like some of the removals we still see in South Africa today. And so increasingly, basically wage work became more a male blue-collar work, and this was seen as real work, whereas the unwaged social reproduction work, which was largely female, looking after the old, looking after young, and so forth, all of that was seen as subordinate and less important work under capitalism. But of course, there were all kinds of economic crises of capitalist production, and this produced huge waves of unemployment in the developed capitalist world of Britain, of France, of the United States a little bit later, and so on. And this was partly solved by the emigration to the colonies of large impoverished unemployed workers. So my great-grandparents and my grandfather, in fact, were basically unemployed workers who came to South Africa. And that's how in the developed world, they partially solved their unemployment problem, was through immigration, obviously, at the cost of the indigenous people here in colonies. Okay, but even when workers were employed, the wage of a typical male worker was insufficient to support the household. And therefore, these early reforms didn't resolve the underlying capitalist crises of social reproduction, and therefore ultimately continued to contribute to the crises of the capitalist system itself. Let's move along. Okay. So particularly after 1945 and the end of the Second World War, basically what we saw in the more developed capitalist countries was the development of what we can call the social welfare state. Now, interestingly, this was partly responsible to the fact that after the Second World War, a powerful socialist bloc of countries anchored around the Soviet Union, but in Eastern Europe in particular, but also then quite soon after that in China, basically we saw the emergence of a strong, in the world system, a strong socialist system, which had full employment, something that capitalism had never been able to provide. It provided socialized worker housing, public health systems, free education to men and to women, affordable publicly owned public transport, and so on and so forth. And so so what developed then was a Cold War competition between the socialist system and capitalism. And capitalism was forced then to make reforms, including into social reproduction, in order to show that they could do just as well, that capitalism could manage the plight of workers or equally well. And so this meant that there was the development in Sweden, in Norway, and Denmark, and in Britain, in France, in Germany, in different forms, social welfare states, in which the key social reproduction needs were now increasingly publicly provided: public creches, public housing, municipal housing for workers, public transport that was affordable, healthcare, the National Health Service, which still exists in Britain, for instance, and public education. But it was still built on the model of a single male, basically, wage earner, a nuclear suburban family, and a housewife, which I've pictured there in that thing. Let's move to the next slide. Okay. Now, that system of the social welfare system in the developed capitalist world then bumped into its next crisis, okay? The crisis of the welfare system. And why? Well, first of all, capitalism cannot handle full employment. So in some of those societies, they managed, as a result of the welfare system and full employment and high taxes on the capitalist class, to provide near full employment. But when there's near full employment, that hugely increases the bargaining power of the working class, of trade unions. So when they go to, the bosses can't say to them, if you don't like the wage you're getting, go home. There are plenty of other unemployed workers at the factory gate and we can hire them. So for all of these reasons, the welfare system, which had existed in the developed capitalist countries from about 1945 to the early 1970s, began to become a problem, not for the working class, but for capital, which didn't want to continue paying high taxes to support this welfare system. And so what we got was the growth towards the end of the 1970s of neoliberalism. And so we're now still living in the era of neoliberal capitalism. And what that meant was that Swedish capital, British capital, German capital, and so forth, broke the social accord which underpinned the welfare state and sought to take their money out of those countries to globalize and to invest in low-wage markets in Southeast Asia, in China, because remember, China had now begun to introduce reforms and opened up a huge, cheap labor market from the late 1970s, and also in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. And so basically, the welfare state was rolled back by Margaret Thatcher, by Nixon in the United States and others. There was the increasing privatization of health, of housing, of water, of public transport, and it was either forced back into the household. So women basically had to take on the responsibilities that public creches had once provided, or it was provided on a market, but a privatized market, no longer affordable to working class people. Okay, so let me move along. There are other things, but let's move along so that we save some time. Okay. Now, that neoliberalization of the welfare state was exposed. The crisis for the working class and the broad middle classes was exposed by the recent 2008 global economic crisis, and now more drastically by the COVID-19 crises. Okay. The pursuit of profitability by the capitalist class and the undermining of the public provision, social provision of social reproduction measures has created huge problems now for capitalism in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. So, for instance, Cronin will have seen that in Sweden, which has one of the highest levels of mortality in Western Europe, and Sweden was once the model of social welfare. And where there's been a huge outbreak of COVID-19 deaths has been in care homes for the elderly in Sweden, which used to be publicly provided at basically free or at very low cost. They became privatized increasingly, and with all of the shortcuts that privatized provision of these things occur, they've become completely exposed to the pandemic. Of course, the most obvious example of what happens when you have a neoliberalized privatization of healthcare, privatization of housing, privatization of everything is Trump's United States, where there's just this runaway mortality rates and so forth, as a result basically of the cutting back, neoliberalization, if you like, of social reproduction measures. And this contrasts hugely with the very important successes of socialist countries like Cuba, of China, and even of a small state in India, Kerala, where because they have got socialized reproduction, good healthcare, so I've just got it, okay, and so forth, that they've been able to handle the pandemic much better. Let's move to just excuse me, I've got a dog which is causing problems. Okay, Cronin. So that was quite a long-winded, and I apologize for the length of it, but I think it's very important that we try to get an understanding of what we mean by social reproduction and how we understand how under capitalism, social reproduction has been affected by different attempts at sustaining capitalist profitability. Now, I want to turn to South Africa specifically because South Africa, the evolution of social reproduction in South Africa has got its own special features, which I think are important for us to understand if we're to understand what we're dealing with in the current reality. And of course, South Africa being South Africa, basically we've developed what I'm calling here a bipolar, or if you like, a racialized or a two-track social reproduction system. So this slide is basically dealing with how the reproduction of a white working class and a white society within South Africa was reproduced. So I've already said that in the 19th century, there was significant colonial immigration into colonies and into the South from the industrialized North to solve the unemployment problem. Of course, there's the reverse flow is now happening, massive immigration from the South into the North, which is a topic for another day. Okay. Now, in the late 19th century here in South Africa and into the early 20th century, basically South Africa had its industrial revolution around mining, gold mining, diamond mining, and so forth. And one of the conditions for mining operations was actually the so-called Anglo-Boer War, in which the British colonial army practiced a scorched earth policy against Afrikaans, the Boer farms, and there was massive expropriation and proletarianization of an unskilled Afrikaner rural population. And that created a poor white crisis in South Africa, with large numbers of Afrikaners who had previously lived on farms and exploited black people terribly, of course, were now thrown onto the labor market as poor whites. And in the 1920s, a white welfare system began to develop through struggles by whites and white unions, basically, and a white Labour Party. And so we had a white welfare system developing. And that continued right through. By the mid-1970s, there were deepening problems for this white welfarism, essentially because the apartheid state was now enmeshed in a huge military and police struggle to repress our liberation struggle, not just here in South Africa, but in Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and so forth. And there were also increasing sanctions against apartheid South Africa. So that resulted in an economic decline and a difficulty of sustaining the white welfare system. Okay, let's move along. Next slide. But on the other hand, okay, when we come to the black side of social reproduction in South Africa, we know that between the 17th and 19th centuries, there was the colonial conquest of indigenous societies. But not all the land was expropriated. So by the beginning of South Africa in the late 19th century, large numbers of African people had been expropriated of their land, but had been pushed into native reserves, essentially. And then the mining industry required huge masses of unskilled laborers. Basically, it turned to these so-called native reserves and imposed taxes, mining taxes, hut taxes, dog taxes, head taxes, and so on, to force people living there to earn money, to come to the mining centers, basically, to earn money. But this was cheap labor because it wasn't being reproduced through a welfare system in the cities, but through the social reproduction. And that's an illustration we can see of poor self-subsistence farming carried on the back of women who were locked into these reserves, who took the responsibility for childcare, for looking after the old, the sickly, and the injured, many of whom, the sickly and injured were coming back from the mines. Okay, so that was the early system of how a racialized form of capitalism developed in South Africa on the back of cheap labor. And that labor was made cheap by the form in which the labor was socially reproduced, basically in the what were called native reserves. But by 1950, there was a crisis of the native reserves as well. Their capacity to carry and to reproduce, socially reproduce an endless supply of cheap migrant laborers to the mines and to industry more generally was increasingly diminished because of overcrowding, because of soil erosion, and so on. And so we need to understand apartheid, which came, apartheid in the formal sense, arrived with the 1948 election of the National Party and the implementation of apartheid measures. And apartheid can be understood as a form, in part, we need to understand apartheid as an attempt to modernize the racialized social reproduction of cheap black labor. And now the township begins to replace, not completely, the rural reserve as the new site for the social reproduction of black labor. And instead of annual migrancy from rural reserves into factories and into mines, basically what we get increasingly from the 1950s and 60s is daily migrancy from semi-peripheral townships on the outskirts of towns, far away from the production centers. And so the township becomes the main site of black exclusion, but also inclusion. The whole idea is not to exclude black people from the economy, from the capitalist economy, but to locate them beyond the core centers of power, but to bring them in, to ship them in on a daily basis, to come and work in the factories, to shop in the white shops, to work in white homes and so forth. And so ironically, what happens from 1976 onwards with the Soweto uprisings and so on is that this the township becomes the key site of also our resistance, of the liberation struggle, of organized popular power, of semi-insurrectionary ongoing struggles from 1976 right through the 1980s. So South Africa's liberation struggle is a bit different from other liberation struggles of the late 19th, 20th century. If we're talking about Cuba or China or Angola or Mozambique or even Zimbabwe, that those were much more rural guerrilla struggles supported by peasantry. In South Africa, our liberation struggle was much more a struggle of stayaways, of boycotts, of a proletarian struggle in which the township was used as the key organizing base rather than the remote countryside. Let's move along. Okay. So just to develop that point a little bit about how apartheid was an attempt to modernize racially inferior social reproduction, to sustain it, but to modernize it. So apartheid correctly, we critique, but at the same time, we need to remember that there was a mass rollout of township housing in that period. There were group areas removals from Sophia Town, from District 6, and from many other places, and people were pushed into townships. But there was also apartheid-era housing. There were bus subsidies supplied to Putcos and other public transport to enable the working class to get to work and get back, of course. There was also the mass construction of township schools in this period. Bantu education, again, we correctly criticized, but at the same time, we need to understand it was a deliberate intervention by the apartheid state, and they spent some money on it. So in 1948, only 2.6% of Black pupils were enrolled in post-primary school. The average schooling for an African child was just 4 years in 1948. In 1953, when Bantu education started, there were less than 1 million. There was 0.8 million Black pupils enrolled in schools. By 1963, as a result of Bantu education, it had increased by 1 million, 1.8 million. And the total spend on Black education grew some 50% between 1962 and 1967. But this wasn't charity, okay? First of all, the capital spend per Black pupil was only 6% of a white pupil in 1968. So what this was an attempt to modernize in a more urban setting, to provide semi-skilled workers now, more urbanized workers with the skills that capitalism required, but to do so on the cheap. But it did require some investments into housing, into Bantu education, and so on. So it's the inferior reproduction under an apartheid form. Next slide. So by the 1980s, there was a crisis, as we've already said, of the white welfare system. It was no longer affordable for capital to perpetuate extensive white welfare system. And so they were beginning to privatize many things. And the township social reproduction had become the site, basically, of our struggle. The townships had become ungovernable. There'd been popular power structures had been erected in these places. And so this was a key factor, this crisis of both white social reproduction and African and township social reproduction was a key driver for why monopoly capital in South Africa supported a negotiated settlement. Okay, it put pressure on the apartheid regime, but also opened up talks with the ANC and so forth in exile to encourage a negotiated settlement. And in a way that was positive. I mean, it was important that that we ended white minority rule in South Africa, but there were two different agendas at play. Okay, we need to understand that. For South African monopoly capital, basically they wanted to end formal apartheid. They didn't want to end capitalism, obviously. They wanted to end formal apartheid in order to end sanctions against capitalism in South Africa. and to address their own crisis of profitability. So they wanted to do what Swedish capital and German capital and Britain capital had begun to do in the 1970s. They wanted to globalize. They didn't want to keep their money in South Africa. They wanted financial liberalization. They wanted exchange controls and prescribed assets, all the things that the apartheid regime had imposed upon them. They wanted those removed. Right, okay, let's move along. Now, the ANC, with its Reconstruction and Development Plan, and the party also, because we supported that plan, in 1994, we went with the RDP to the elections of 1994. And what we wanted to do, if you like, part of what the RDP was wanting to do was to expand the existing welfare system that existed for the white minority, but we wanted to expand it, improve it, and de-racialize it so that it became accessible to all South Africans. But then the debate occurred as to how to resource it. And the RDP's basic argument was there needed to be major redistribution, land redistribution, wealth redistribution, all kinds of redistribution, which would increase demand and participation of people in the economy, that would drive development and produce shared growth. And so there would be what we call a virtuous cycle. But the neoliberals, and they began to increasingly influence key comrades inside of the ANC, had a different perspective, which then was formalized in GEAR, the GEAR program, which the party is sometimes called the 1996 class project. And here the argument was, no. First of all, we must have capitalist-driven growth first. Create conditions for capitalist profitability, and then the capitalists would grow the cake, grow the pie, and that would provide tax resources, fiscal resources, and that we could then expand and de-racialize the welfare state. Okay. And basically, unfortunately, that agenda won out, and the RDP and its philosophy was sidelined. And so basically the idea of the GEAR thing was that we would create an investor-friendly macroeconomic policies. We would remove exchange controls. We would remove prescribed assets. In other words, remove conditions which said to retirement funds and other financial institutions that 20%, let's say, of your investments must go into working class housing or working class transport and so forth. So all of those things were removed. And the philosophy was, and what comrades in the ANC who were driving GEAR were saying was, what we will do is open the doors and windows, and what we will do is get massive investment into the country. But instead what happened there was a massive outflow of capital outside, a massive disinvestment. So monopoly capital used the GEAR liberalization to export legally and often illegally huge amounts of capital out of our country. In 2012, something like 20 to 25% of our GDP just disappeared out of the country. This was investable money that could have gone into production, into job creation, into building better schools, building houses, and so forth. And then there's been massive financialization. What we mean by that is that what money is invested is going into speculative stock exchange gambling, basically, the Zama economy. And so the JSE in South Africa has grown much, much faster than the real productive economy. And so GEAR did produce some growth in the first 5 years or so, but it was jobless growth. And now we haven't even had growth. And obviously with COVID-19, we're going to get into a massive recession. Let's move along. And so basically, another way of understanding what happened with GEAR and with the agenda of monopoly capital in South Africa was to dump the crisis of social reproduction, the crisis of education, of healthcare, of provision of water, of municipal services, and so on, to dump that onto a post-apartheid state. The apartheid regime had not been able to solve those crises, even for whites. And so now they were dumped. It became, if you like, almost an unfunded mandate. So we were crippled by macroeconomic policies, which meant that we didn't have the money to spend, on the one hand, and on the other hand, we had these huge responsibilities, crises of underdevelopment, of homelessness, of terrible public transport, and so forth. But of course, what has happened is that nonetheless, the elite has managed to isolate themselves with the privatized market provision of healthcare, for instance. So 17% of South Africans, and I confess I'm one of those, are covered by medical aids. And so we have access to private healthcare. But for the great majority of South Africans, there is no private healthcare. There's no medical aid coverage. Private schools for the wealthy, private security is available to the old white elite, but also to a partially deracialized new elite as well. And so the crisis realities of poor healthcare, public transport, working class housing, township sustainability, rural schools, and so on, that remains the reality for the majority of South Africans. Next slide. So, I mean, and this crisis is often played out very, very dramatically at the municipal level, the sphere which has many of the most responsibilities in South Africa, but which is also the least resourced very often. So if I could talk to my personal experience, my father died when I was quite young, and so my mother brought up me and my younger brother. She was a widow, and we were, I suppose, what you could call lower middle class, the white South Africans. My mother eventually went to work as a hospital clerk at Groote Schuur Hospital. Okay. But we lived quite well because we lived in a white welfare system. So we couldn't afford a house and we couldn't afford a mortgage, but we lived in a flat that was rent controlled. So it was at a very reasonable rate. We lived right next to the main road, so there was a very good municipal bus service in those days. I had access to a wonderful municipal library where I first discovered Marx, by the way, as a youngster. There was a municipal swimming pool. There were very good municipal parks nearby. And these were funded, one out of taxing business, obviously, but also a white ratepayers base inside of the municipality. And of course, Black people were excluded from all of those realities. So I lived in a white welfare bubble. And as a young person, I always hoped that I didn't expect to be a capitalist and didn't want to be one. But I always hoped that sort of reality would be a reality available to all South Africans, regardless of race. Okay, so that was the kind of welfare bubble. So the majority of white South Africans weren't Oppenheimer or Rupert or whatever. Were working class or middle class and so on, but lived quite well. Okay. So what have we done? Okay, so we've done our best as the ANC-led government. We've done lots of things. For instance, we've provided over 3 million low-cost RDP houses. On the left is a picture of a 1960s apartheid-era township housing. Okay, on the right is a new RDP settlement pattern. But of course, there's no difference between them. In fact, maybe the apartheid-era housing, and maybe some of you have grown up in houses like that, were sometimes better built than the RDP houses. But they're still on the same faraway outskirts, far away from resources and amenities. They're still just dormitory townships. So we've tried to do something as the ANC-led government in this period with housing and other things. But basically, the working class and the poor are still locked into structural poverty, which reproduces all of their problems. Next slide. Okay, the same goes with transport. Okay, so on the left, top, on the left bottom, and down below, taxis, metro rail, all in crisis, massively overcrowded, and so forth. On the top right is, of course, transport for the elite. That's the Gautrain. Okay, very different picture. So again, the crisis of social reproduction of the working class is worse through this period. Next slide. Okay, so just to take another example of social reproduction. So we've tried to roll out ECDs in townships and in rural areas, and they're limited in number. But for the great majority of working class kids, if they're lucky, Basically, they're catered for in this way through thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably of informal creches. So that particular photo is of an informal creche in Tembisa. It doesn't have any public support. It's serving something like 80 working class children. It opens at 5:30 a.m. in the morning and closes at 7 p.m. at night, so that working class parents coming back from faraway workplaces in terrible minibus travel and so on can come and collect their kids. The local Tembisa ECD, which is funded as best as possible through public resources, opens at 8 o'clock, too late for the majority of working class parents who need to leave their kids, and closes at, I'm told, at 2:30. So, you can see again, although we've tried to do things like ECDs and try to respond and to improve social reproduction for the majority of South Africans, overwhelmingly the reality is something that and this is a well-run informal creche, this particular Tembisa, and that's real work that is going on there. Okay, Comrades, I'm coming to an end. Let's go to the next slide. So what has to be done? So I hope that everything I've said, first of all, says that there has to be a major change in macroeconomic policy in our country. No to gear, no to neoliberal austerity. That's exactly what the mainstream economists, the rating agencies, I'm afraid Treasury want to take us back into, is to austerity. As we said right at the beginning, they've identified the crisis as being the crisis of junk status. But that isn't the crisis. The crisis is the huge social crisis that we've got. So we need to have a different macroeconomic policy. There must be much greater capital controls. Let's impose. This is what we agreed upon in 2001 at the Financial Sector Summit. Prescribed assets that big financial institutions that, let's say, at least 20% of their holdings, of their financial assets, must be put into decent housing for the poor, into healthcare, into an NHI, and so forth. Let's really get a better flow on financial outflows, illegal outflows. A huge investable amount of money goes out of our country into tax havens and into Doha and all kinds of things. We need to impose much more effective exchange controls. We need to have the deep developmental deployment of domestic resources, retirement funds, speculative investments that are not helping real development. And of course, we need to end corruption, collusion, and state capture. Put in another way, we need to drive a serious stimulus package. Stimulus for development, stimulus for job creation, for socializing production, and for social reproduction. It can't be stimulus for just returning capitalist firms to capitalist profitability. We've got a business rescue scheme as part of the response to COVID-19. And of course, we do need to rescue large businesses which employ large numbers of workers. But it can't just be allowing them to return to profitability. We need to exert leverage on them so that we really have shared growth and shared development. We need a major labor-intensive infrastructure program which focuses on social and economic infrastructure, and not just on building new things like trains or stadiums in Mbombela, but also on the maintenance of infrastructure in our townships, water infrastructure, sewage infrastructure, and so on. We need a just green transition to enhance our social, but also our environmental resilience. And we need reindustrialization to end South Africa's, we continue to be basically a semi-colony in the global economy. We're exporting unprocessed, unbeneficiated mineral products too often, and we're importing finished products. So we need to reindustrialize so that we develop our economy and our society. So, comrades, that was a long input, and my apologies for the length of it, but hopefully that makes some sense of part of the challenges we're facing and part of what needs to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Comrade Jeremy. And that was quite a presentation. I think comrades may have gotten more than they had bargained for. Unfortunately, we didn't get any questions for this session. However, you have raised quite a number of issues. I just wanted to ask one question, maybe on behalf of those who have been watching, and that people often ask, has the liberation movement sold out, given the current conditions which we find ourselves in? And also, I mean, taking from your presentation as to what has happened over the past number of years since the 1994 democratic breakthrough.
Comrade Tom, there was something that was missing. You said, has the liberation movement
sold out?
Okay, I think that I think serious mistakes have been made, and I think that elements of the liberation movement have sold out. I think that you know, we need to understand the huge ideological and social power of neoliberalized capital globally, but also locally. So I think that comrades who led the process of implementing GEAR, I believe, did so with good intentions. Okay, I think they were wrong, but they were good intentions, and they felt that there were, you know, the Soviet bloc had collapsed, social democracy had been pushed back by Thatcher and others. Even the important progress that had been made in Mozambique after liberation, even in Zimbabwe after liberation, all of those things have been rolled back by internal errors within those countries, by apartheid era destabilization, but also by IMF structural adjustment programs and other things. So there were few inspiring examples left in 1994, if you like, in the mid-1990s. And so I think that the sheer pressure of the World Bank, of the IMF, of big capital inside South Africa, had a huge impact on comrades and persuaded them, look, it's GEAR or nothing. Unless we implement capital-friendly macroeconomic policies, your country will end up like Zimbabwe, they would say. So you've got to go that route. And I think, so I think that the intentions were there. And we never had neoliberalism in its full-blooded form. So there was always redistribution. So there was RDP housing. There was investment in social grants, for instance. We've got 17 million social grant recipients. But I think that all of those were imprisoned within the prison, if you like, or the prison cell of a GEAR macroeconomic policy. And that is what we have to break out of now. We can't go back into that crisis before the crisis. So I wouldn't describe it as a sellout, although obviously there were comrades who sold out through state capture, through corruption, and things like that. But yeah, I would describe it more as ideological errors of a serious kind, which have had a serious impact on our country.
Okay. No, thank you so much, Comrade Jeremy. I was trying to pass time hoping that the comrades will send their questions. It looks like the presentation was so good that they didn't have anything to say.
Okay, maybe it was too complicated and too long, so I've put them to sleep.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. Hope to see you again. Thank you,
yes,
Amanda.
Yes, of course, lovely. Right, yeah. Amanda, thank you, Comrade.
Sure. Well, that was Comrade Jeremy, comrades, and this was his presentation. We'll try to make the presentation available online. So if you go visit the SACP Mpumalanga discussion online, you'll definitely see or find the link to the presentation. Amandla for now. Adios.